This is Bill Newman, WHMP.
Welcome to the show, and welcome to NPR, Northampton Poetry Radio, with our erstwhile poet laureate, Rich Michelson.
Oh, I haven't heard those dulcet tones in a while. It's good to be back with the fall and new season of NPR, Northampton Poetry Radio, and especially pleased today because my first guest of the new season is also one of my dearest friends, one of the Valley's premier poets, Doug Anderson, author of The Moon Reflected Fire, which won a Kate Tufts Discovery Award, Blues for the Unemployed Secret Police, and his new book, Horse Medicine. Doug will be reading this Saturday, September 29th, 3 p.m. at the Forbes Library, along with Rachel Blum. That's this Saturday, 3 p.m. at the Forbes Library, The Poetry of War and Loss. So we're going to start out with a cheery day. Welcome, Doug. Good to have you back.
Hi, Rich.
And I'm going to read from your flyer here. It says, "What is unbearable will be heard or sicken the silent body." Doug Anderson began writing, and Rachel Blum began writing because they can no longer be silent. So tell us a little bit about what you're doing Saturday. Let's start with that sentence.
Yeah, well, when I read Rachel's work, I was taken back to this knowledge that there are points where we become most deeply human, and that's in loss. And when we experience something that we can't speak of, that is unspeakable, ultimately that's a sign that it will be spoken. It must be spoken. And for many of us, that's where we began writing, what we could not keep silent about.
Mm-hmm. Well, we go back to the famous line, "Poetry after Auschwitz is impossible because you can't speak about that."
Yes.
And of course, that phrase preceded a flood of memories above it.
Oh, yeah.
So if we need to bring what we can't deal with to words, talk to me a little bit about the difference between poetry and therapy.
Well, poetry is art. Therapy is opening your soul in the presence of a compassionate professional. Poetry requires work, knowledge, craft, like music. You cannot write it without knowing the craft. Are
you healing yourself? Are you healing the audience?
Well, I think that most art comes from a healing place at some point. Aristotle wrote the Poetics about a catharsis, a group catharsis, whereby people brought their suffering to the surface. That he used a medical metaphor is no accident.
Mm-hmm. And give us a taste. Let's start out. Again, this is NPR. My guest is Doug Anderson, Northampton Poetry Radio. We'll be reading this Saturday at the Forbes Library at 3 p.m. Let's start with a poem of yours from one of my favorite books, The Moon Reflected Fire.
North of Tamkey, 1967. You were dead when I got there. Managed to drag yourself almost to the tree line across the sandy, open place they planned to kill us in. The clearing I would have to crawl to get to you, and did. The tracers crossing overhead. The round caught you dropping to the ground, entering long ways between neck and shoulder, taking the artery, the lung. I had inside me in those days a circuit breaker between head and heart that shut out everything but the clarity of fear. I felt nothing for you then, rolling you over, looking for the exit wound, nor when I put my mouth on yours and blew, hearing the gurgle that told me you had drowned in your own blood. I knew only the muzzle flashes too close in front, the sniper cracking on my left, and I flipped the switch and went cold, the same whose wires I tinker with these 23 years after, a filament flickering in the heart, and then the blaze of light.
That's Doug Anderson reading from his book, The Moon Reflected Fire. He will be reading this Saturday at the Forbes Library at 3 p.m. A powerful, powerful poem. And you were a medic in Vietnam.
Yeah, I was a hospital corpsman with the Marines.
And your book, which I think is one of the best books I've read about the Vietnam War, Keep Your Head Down, Vietnam, the 60s, and a Journal of Self-Discovery, was published by W. Norton in 2009. I think I want to recommend that to everyone. I think it's really gives you a sense of this.
Could I ask one question?
Sure.
Because of the Vietnam War poems by Doug Anderson are beyond what anyone should have to experience in poetry. I think they're just so visceral and so moving. And what I'd like to know from you, Doug, were you writing poetry before Vietnam, or did Vietnam inspire you to write?
I piddled around with poetry before I went to Vietnam. Vietnam was my basic education that supersedes all other forms of education that I've had.
Did you write while you were there, or is this recollected in tranquility?
I attempted to keep a journal, but after a while, the part of my mind that might have had the contemplative space to keep a journal was gone.
Mm-hmm. And
how long did you serve?
I was in Vietnam 13 months. I was active duty 2 years.
I know, because that was your first book of poetry, you really got labeled as a war poet. And I know for a little bit, I think we spoke about this at one point, you resisted that label.
I did, yeah, I did very much because I wanted to write and have written about many other things, and I didn't want to get ghettoized. I still do get associated with the war.
Sure.
I'd rather be just known as a poet.
Well, your latest book, Horse Medicine, I know covers so many topics, and, I think of you, frankly, as a love poet. Doug and I have been sharing poems on and off for about 25 years. We try to get together Monday nights when we can, and for me, it's often the high point of my week when the two of us can manage to be in the same room at the same time. Can you read us a poem from Horse Medicine, and then we'll get to Rachel's poems as well.
Okay. This is an homage to Wim Wenders' film Wings of Desire, which may be my favorite film. Wings of Desire. The way the angels walk down the subway car, listen to people who could be us, our dark songs, ground glass obsessions, and see that we somehow have the gravitas not to cry out like the street corner mad. The way we shoulder what we've been handed that grows heavier as our knees turn to dust, and how we sometimes look ahead to death, not out of fear, but for a coming mercy. How could they not fall in love with us and defect, like Jesus, to the earth and be broken like him?
That's Doug Anderson. You're listening to NPR, Northampton Poetry Radio, on the Bill Newman Show. And Doug will be reading this Saturday, September 29th, 3 p.m. at the Forbes Library, along with Rachel Bloom. And I don't want to ignore her. She is not joining us. I know she's a friend of yours. And tell us quickly a little something about Rachel, and maybe read a very short poem.
Rachel is a natural lyric poet in the tradition of Rilke and has extraordinary subtlety and sweetness in dealing with horrific things, things that unimaginable losses, and in the case of this book, the loss of a daughter to a brain tumor. One of her lines says it, it's central to her work. I cried only privately as if I had no clothing. What an extraordinary image, the fact that there are certain points in our suffering that we become naked, that there are no more pretensions of any kind. I'd like to read her short invocation to this book, if we have time.
Please.
Okay. The unfathomable part of death is love. So we invented the soul to be at ship. Because what is the soul, if not the collection of our loves? Distilled to a form like the hull, blooming into dark water, and as full of meaning as the soft face of the horses.
That's a poem by Rachel Bloom, who will be joining Doug Anderson this Saturday. Love and loss. You can't have one without the other.
True.
And you're digging deep in this. I think this is going to be a fantastic reading. I really encourage everyone to come out this Saturday. It's a busy week. It's always a busy fall for poetry. Tonight, Tuesday night at Smith College, I also want to mention that Ada Limon is giving a reading.
Poet.
In the Smith College Poetry Series. So try to get there as well if you can. And what's new, Doug? What are you working on? Are you working on your next book?
I have 3 books, one of which is
3 books that you're working on writing and completing?
In the tradition of my ADHD. And one of them is writing new cantos into Dante's Inferno to accommodate events and persons since Dante's death.
And they are fun. I've read some of them, and it's an amazing, rollicking experience.
Dante's Inferno is a rollicking experience.
It is.
Okay, just want to make sure I'm following this conversation.
Yeah, it's a divine comedy, and there are funny sections in Dante. Yeah.
And what else?
I have a novel that's sitting on the back burner because my agent didn't like it, and I have to go back and fix it.
Either that or get a new agent?
Either that or get a new agent. And I have an almost completed book of poems, which I hope to have at some publisher in another year or so.
Great. My friend Doug Anderson was reading this Saturday at the Forbes Library at 3 p.m. along with Rachel Bloom. I hope you can all make it. Doug, it's been a pleasure, as usual. Thanks for joining us on the first edition of Northampton Poetry Radio for the new season.
Really?
Thanks, Rich.
Northampton Poetry Radio with erstwhile Poet Laureate Rich Michelson and his special guest, Doug Anderson.
Thank you.
This is Bill Newman, WHMP.